If you've been following my channel for a while, you're probably familiar by now with how I'm interested in books that are about subcultures. And those subcultures could be any size. They could be just a few people, or they could be a whole wing of society. But whenever there's a book that's about a particular subculture, I always pick it up and find myself fascinated by it, because I found that books about subcultures make for excellent resources for writing science fiction and fantasy. We have this tendency to think about science fiction and fantasy worlds in a very stratified way, in a vertical way. There's the top, the middle, the bottom, people existing at all those different layers. But we don't think as much about it in terms of the center versus the edges, I find, because there's a center and an edge to every single one of those strata. And the further down you go, the further away the edges are from the center. So stories that draw on real-world examinations of what happens out at the fringes of society or in pockets of society that we don't necessarily get to see directly. Those fascinate me, and they make for great reading material. They make for great inspiration. And one of the books I found recently that talks about a whole subculture, and not just a subculture, but the way that subculture documents itself and evangelizes for itself, and in a way propagandizes for itself. The book in question is called Notes from Underground, Zines and the Politics of Alternative Culture. Now, I'm very familiar with Zine Culture. I was familiar with it before I picked the book up. I have a number of friends who are very deeply into it and who have been part of it for quite some time. And I'm fascinated by the culture of people who make things with their own hands, who produce things that are designed to be passed between peers. So I was doubly primed, perhaps even triply primed for this book. And when I opened it up, I was quite surprised at the approach, because it is not a hagiography. The author's intention is not to say, wow, zines are fantastic and zines are great. It's to say, these are the kinds of people that get into the zine scene. These are the kinds of things they're doing, and these are the implications of what they're trying to do. And those implications are not always positive. So he's critical, but he's critical in a constructive way, and I appreciated that. He wasn't simply trying to run around and praise everything that he saw. He found some examples of how zine culture can be quite insular, some examples of how it can be often counterproductive, but he was never completely negative, never completely down on the whole thing. And so he talks about a lot of the different aspects of the zine world. Who gets in there? Who makes zines? What are they trying to do with them? What kinds of topics do they cover? And when it comes to topics, for instance, a lot of people are familiar with zines that focus on some specific cultural thing like music, or maybe, politics at the fringes. And so he does touch on those things, but he also points out that there's a tremendous number of zines that are hyper-focused. They focus on some incredibly specific thing where the documentation of it doesn't necessarily have any commercial value, but which is of great personal interest to whoever is doing the documenting. And so the passion with which they document it, and the humor and the relatability, it's like a good friend writing to you about something really interesting that happened to them the other week. So they have that approachable flavor to them. And that's another one of those things that I really enjoy. Now, I should also talk a little bit about that subtitle, The Politics of Alternative Culture, because the culture that you find in the zine world tends to be left of center, and that's reflected in a lot of the subject matter and their treatments of it. Things like the futility of work, or, the annoyances of capitalism, and a lot of the other things that we tend to wrestle with on a day-to-day basis, and they tend to look at those things with a fairly left-leaning lens. And one of the points the author makes is that even though there may not necessarily be individually constructive suggestions in these things, sometimes it's just complaining, the fact that you're hearing the voice of somebody else doing that complaining can itself be a constructive gesture. It's nice to know that you're not alone, and that there are other people out there who are, reaching across the aisle through time and space, trying to get you to know that they feel the same way you do. And that by itself is a form of solidarity. That's something that all of us, I think, need to hear at least once, when we're really ground down by life, and then we bump into somebody who is aggressively documenting those feelings, putting them into a physical form, making an artifact out of them. And that's cool and heartening at the same time. It's great to see people turning these things into actual art, as opposed to just mere documentation or journalism. Not that those things are bad, but having that additional layer of artfulness and ambition on top of it makes it even better. Now, let me bring all of this back to topic number one, which is how these things are useful in science fiction and fantasy. Now, I've touched on this a little bit at the beginning of the video, talked about how you, in societies that are in both of those types of stories, you have the center and you have the edges. And when you look at the way zine culture works, you get a sense of how those edges can talk about themselves, can document themselves, can propagandize for themselves. And so in a science fiction world, whether, one that's based on the immediate present day or, somewhat into the future, there's almost certainly going to be some of the same kind of phenomenon. You're going to see something very similar to that, the business of getting the word out about whatever it is you're doing on the down low so the authorities don't squash you under their boot. But the same thing could apply in a fantasy setting too, provided you have the right pieces. If you have, at this point, in the world that you're building, something akin to the printing press, guess what? You can have something akin to the zine. The 95 Theses were a perfect example of this from the early days. As long as you can make copies of something, it becomes that much easier to spread word and to build connections horizontally. And even if it still means just copying things by hand, let's say you have a broadsheet that can be copied relatively quickly by hand and that condenses all of the things that you want to say to whoever it is you're trying to reach into just a few words. That by itself is a useful act. So having some mechanism in your world by which people are documenting what they're doing and reaching out through time and space to find peers to do it, I think that both a science fiction setting and a fantasy setting can benefit from having that kind of thing. And when you read a book like this, you also get a sense of what kinds of pockets exist in the world, what kinds of fascinations people have, what kind of grudges people have, what kinds of things are they trying to document. And that also includes the documentation of the people doing the documentation. There's a fairly significant section in the book about a zine called Fact Sheet 5, which was kind of like a whole earth catalog for zines. It was originally designed to be an index of other zines, and eventually it outgrew its container and became something that was so outsized and unmanageable that the guy who originally started it couldn't continue to hang on to it in that form, and it has kind of a tragic ending, unfortunately. But that basic idea still applies, that you will have people who also try to document the documenters and to help spread larger word about it. And that can happen in any number of ways. And the point being that in your world, you're going to have people who are off in the margins and who are going to try to reach out across the margins, or maybe even reach out from the margins towards the center. And if you have some idea of how zine culture does that in the real world, you have that many more ways to figure out how to do it in your story. So I encourage you to check this book out if you're curious about how that kind of thing could work, and also just for the material itself. This is a wonderfully absorbing book. There's something interesting on every page, and it again, another thing I liked about it is that it's honest. It does not try to condescend either to the reader or to its subject matter. And I think more books that are about a scene, that are about a pocket of society that we don't necessarily contact directly, can benefit from that approach. So once again, the title is Notes from Underground, Zines and the Politics of Alternative Culture. It is available in print and also digitally on Amazon. And if anything I've said has encouraged you to check it out, do check it out. And until next time, stay curious.